There is a voice inside you that is not yours. Not exactly. It speaks in images, not words. It arrives uninvited, in the middle of a dream, in that strange moment just before you fall asleep, in a flash of something that feels more like memory than imagination. And then it's gone, and you spend the rest of the day wondering if you invented it. You didn't. What if I told you that the most precise psychological instrument ever developed isn't a drug, isn't a therapy technique, isn't a meditation app? It's a conversation, a real one, with something inside you that has been waiting with extraordinary patience for you to finally sit down and listen. Jung called it active imagination, and he didn't discover it in a laboratory. He discovered it in the years when he himself was coming apart. You've been there before. That moment when you're in the shower or driving somewhere familiar and a thought arrives that doesn't feel like yours. An image, a face, a scene that plays out behind your eyes with a clarity that surprises you, and then disappears the second you try to hold it. You probably dismissed it, filed it under random or just my mind wandering, moved on. But what if it wasn't random? What if that was your unconscious doing exactly what it's always doing, trying to get your attention through the only language it actually speaks? Not words, not logic, images, symbols, scenes that carry more emotional weight than any rational thought you've had all day. Here's something worth sitting with. You spend most of your waking life managing, filtering, deciding what to think, what to feel, what to let through, and what to push back down. You've become remarkably good at it. So good, in fact, that you probably don't even notice you're doing it anymore. It's automatic. A kind of interior security system that runs in the background, keeping the surface clean, keeping things functional, keeping you moving. And underneath all of that, underneath the managing and the filtering and the holding together, something else is moving. Something that doesn't follow your schedule, doesn't respond to your logic, doesn't care about your to-do list or your carefully constructed sense of who you are. It has its own agenda, its own timing, its own way of making itself known. Most people experience this as disruption, as anxiety that arrives without a clear cause, as dreams that leave a residue you can't shake, as a persistent feeling that something important is being left unsaid, not to anyone else but to yourself, as that low, quiet hum beneath ordinary life that occasionally gets loud enough to stop you mid-sentence and ask, what is actually going on with me? That hum is not a malfunction. It's a signal. And active imagination is, at its most essential, the practice of turning toward that signal instead of away from it, of sitting down, deliberately with full awareness, and saying, I'm here, I'm listening, show me what you need me to see. It sounds simple. It isn't. Because what lives in that interior space isn't always comfortable. It isn't always kind. It doesn't arrive wearing the face of something you'll immediately recognize as wisdom. Sometimes it arrives as grief you thought you'd finished with, as anger you were certain you'd resolved, as a figure that unsettles you, or a scene that makes no immediate sense, or a feeling so old you'd forgotten it had a shape. But it's yours, all of it. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that changes something real in a person, is what happens when you stop running from it and start actually meeting it, not analyzing it from a distance, not interpreting it before it's finished speaking, meeting it the way you would meet another person, with presence, with attention, with the willingness to be surprised by what you hear. That is the confrontation, not a battle, not a conquest. A meeting that has been waiting for longer than you probably realize. Let's be precise about something, because this is where most people get it wrong. Active imagination is not visualization. It's not manifestation. It's not guided meditation where a calm voice tells you to imagine a peaceful beach and breathe slowly until you feel better. Those things have their place. This is something different, fundamentally different, and the difference matters. When you visualize, you are in control. You choose the image, you direct it, you decide what happens. Your ego is running the show from beginning to end, which means you only ever see what you already know. You only ever hear what you've already thought. The whole exercise stays safely within the borders of what you've consciously constructed about yourself and your life. Active imagination begins exactly where that control ends. You start with something real, an image that appeared in a dream, a feeling that won't leave, a figure that keeps returning to the edge of your awareness, something that came from below, not from above. And then you give it space. You let it move. You watch what it does without immediately rushing in to interpret it, fix it, or make it mean something comfortable. And here is the part that takes courage. You engage with it. You ask it questions. You let it speak. You respond. Not from the part of you that already has all the answers, but from the part that is genuinely willing to not know. Genuinely willing to be told something it didn't expect. Genuinely willing to discover that what it thought was weakness is actually something it has never properly looked at. Jung described this as giving the unconscious a chance to play its hand, to show what it's holding. And what it's holding is almost always something you recognize the moment you see it, even if you couldn't have named it before. Think about the last time something hit you emotionally in a way that felt disproportionate. A comment someone made that shouldn't have landed as hard as it did. A situation that triggered a reaction you couldn't fully explain. A dream that left you unsettled for days without you being able to say exactly why. That disproportionate quality, that excess, is almost always a signal. It means something below the surface was touched, something that has weight, something that has been waiting for acknowledgement. Active imagination is how you go back to that place, deliberately, with your eyes open. Not to relive it, not to analyze it into pieces until it becomes an intellectual exercise and loses all its charge, but to actually meet whatever is there, to let it be as large as it actually is, to stop managing it from a safe distance and instead sit close enough to hear what it's really saying. This is why Jung considered it one of the most important practices he ever developed. Not because it was comfortable, because it was honest, because it bypassed the elaborate systems we build to protect ourselves from ourselves, and created a direct line between the conscious mind and everything it had learned to ignore. The practice has a shape, it has a method. But before the method, there has to be something else. There has to be the willingness to discover that you are larger than you think you are. That what you've been calling your mind is only the part you've been allowed to see. And that somewhere below the surface, something has been building a map of everything you've ever felt, feared, wanted, lost, buried, and forgotten. And it has been waiting with remarkable patience for you to finally ask to see it. At some point in this practice, something unexpected happens. You sit down, you close your eyes, you hold the image. Whatever came from a dream, whatever feeling has been following you, whatever figure appeared at the edge of something and wouldn't quite leave, you give it space, and then it moves, on its own, in a direction you didn't choose. And you realize, with a quiet shock, that you are not making this up. That is the moment everything changes, because the figures that emerge in active imagination are not characters you invented. They are not projections of what you want to find. They surprise you. They say things you didn't expect. They push back when you try to lead them somewhere comfortable. They have, and this is the word Jung used, and he meant it precisely, autonomy. They behave as if they exist independently of your conscious will, because in a very real psychological sense they do. Jung encountered this in his own interior work and spent years trying to understand what it meant. What he arrived at was this: the psyche is not a single unified thing. It is more like a community, a collection of interior figures, some of them old, some of them foreign to your conscious personality, some of them carrying qualities you've spent your entire life either idealized or rejected, all of them real in the sense that they carry genuine psychological weight. You've met some of them already. You just didn't have a name for them. The inner critic that speaks in a voice that sounds suspiciously like someone from your past. The part of you that wants something completely different from what you've built. The figure that appears in dreams with a face you don't recognize, but a presence that feels unnervingly familiar. The voice that says things you would never say aloud. Things that embarrass you or frighten you or move you in ways you can't explain. These are not random noise. They are interior persons, and they have things to say that your conscious mind genuinely needs to hear. The practice of active imagination gives them a place to speak, not to take over. That distinction is crucial. The goal is never to dissolve the boundary between conscious and unconscious, never to simply surrender to whatever arises. The goal is dialogue, real dialogue, with all the tension and discomfort that real dialogue involves. You speak. It speaks. You disagree. It holds its ground. You ask why. It shows you something you weren't expecting. And slowly, across many sessions, across many conversations that feel stranger than anything you've ever done, and more honest than most conversations you've had with actual people, something shifts. The figures that once felt threatening begin to feel more like carriers of something you needed. The anger that arrived with a face you didn't want to look at turns out to be protecting something tender underneath. The grief that kept returning wasn't unfinished mourning. It was an unlived part of you, trying to be recognized. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry dressed up as psychology. This is what actually happens when a person stops treating their interior life as a problem to be managed and starts treating it as a territory to be explored. The figures are already there. They've been there for years. Some of them have been shaping your decisions, your relationships, your fears, your desires, from below without your awareness, without your consent. Active imagination doesn't create them. It simply finally gives them a chair at the table. And what happens next, what gets said in those conversations, is almost always the thing you most needed to hear and spent the longest time making sure you never would. There is a moment in this practice that almost everyone reaches. and almost everyone turns back. It doesn't happen at the beginning. At the beginning, there is curiosity, maybe even excitement, the sense that you are finally doing something real, something that goes beneath the surface in a way that all your other attempts at self-understanding never quite managed. The first images arrive and they are interesting. The first figures speak, and what they say is surprising enough to keep you engaged. You feel, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that you are actually making contact with something true about yourself. And then something harder arrives. It might be an image that disturbs you in a way you can't immediately rationalize, a figure that doesn't behave the way you'd like, a feeling that rises up from somewhere so deep that it has no name yet, only weight, only presence, only the unmistakable quality of something that has been waiting a very long time and is not interested in being rushed past. And the mind does what the mind has always done when it encounters something it cannot immediately control. It reaches for an exit. Sometimes the exit looks like skepticism. Suddenly you are not sure this practice is real. Suddenly it seems naive, or self-indulgent, or suspiciously unscientific. You start analysing the images instead of staying with them. You retreat into your head, into interpretation, into theory, into the comfortable distance of thinking about your inner world rather than actually being in it. Sometimes the exit looks like distraction. You remember something you need to do. Your phone becomes very interesting. You tell yourself you'll come back to it later, when you have more time, when you feel more ready. Later never comes. You were ready. You just didn't know what ready would feel like. And sometimes, this is the one worth paying attention to. The exit looks like the practice itself. You keep sitting down. You keep closing your eyes. But without realizing it, you've started directing things again. You've started steering the figures toward conclusions you've already drawn. You've started having the conversations you already know how to have, with versions of your interior world that have been safely domesticated. You are going through the motions of confrontation while carefully avoiding anything that would actually confront you. Jung called this inflation, the ego's way of colonizing the unconscious rather than genuinely meeting it, of taking the images and immediately translating them into something the conscious mind can feel good about, of turning what should be a dialogue into a monologue with better scenery. The real practice requires something most of us were never taught to do. It requires tolerating not knowing, sitting with a figure that unsettles you without immediately demanding that it makes sense. Holding an image that carries pain without rushing to resolve that pain before you've actually felt it. Staying in the room with your own interior long enough for something genuine to happen. Not the thing you hoped would happen, not the insight that would be most convenient, but the thing that is actually true. This is the confrontation the title speaks of, not a confrontation with some external enemy, a confrontation with the parts of yourself that you have spent the most energy, the most creativity, the most unconscious effort avoiding. And here is what nobody tells you about that confrontation. It is not as destructive as you fear. What you find on the other side of the thing you've been most afraid to look at is almost never what you imagined. The monster behind the door is almost always smaller than the door itself. The grief, when you finally let it be as large as it is, turns out to be survivable. The anger, when you stop suppressing it long enough to ask what it's protecting, turns out to be standing guard over something you actually care about. The practice doesn't break you. It shows you how much of yourself you've been leaving outside in the cold. And once you've seen that, once you've actually sat across from one of those interior figures and had a real conversation, one that surprised you, one that moved something, you cannot unknow it. You cannot go back to treating your interior life as background noise. Something has been met, and meeting changes things. At some point, the question stops being whether this is real and starts being something more practical. How do I actually do this? And I want to answer that honestly. Not with a 5-step framework, not with a technique that promises results if you follow the instructions correctly. Because active imagination is not a technique in that sense, it's more like learning to swim. You can read about it endlessly and understand everything about it intellectually and still have no idea what it feels like until you're actually in the water. So what I can give you is not a formula. What I can give you is a door. The first thing you need is silence. Not the performed silence of someone who is trying very hard to be quiet, but actual stillness. The kind that feels slightly uncomfortable at first because you are so unaccustomed to not filling it. Most people discover, the moment they sit down to do this, just how loud their ordinary mental noise actually is. Thoughts about tomorrow, replays of yesterday, the low hum of unfinished business that follows you everywhere. You don't need to silence all of that. You just need to let it settle, like sediment in water. You wait, and it slowly sinks, and something clearer rises. Then you find your starting point. This is important. Active imagination doesn't begin in abstraction. It begins with something specific that came from below. A dream image that stayed with you. A feeling in your body that arrived without explanation. A figure that appeared somewhere in your imagination and felt realer than it should have. A scene that keeps returning. You don't manufacture this starting point. You find it. It's already there. It has been asking for your attention in the only ways it knows how. You hold that image. You don't analyze it. Not yet. You simply look at it the way you would look at something in the physical world, with genuine curiosity, with openness, without already knowing what it means. And then you wait to see if it moves. It will move. Not always immediately. Sometimes the first few sessions feel like sitting in a room waiting for someone who is taking their time to arrive. That waiting is not wasted. That waiting is itself a signal to your unconscious, to everything below the surface, that you are serious, that you are not here to extract a quick insight and leave, that you are willing to stay. And when something does begin to happen, when the image shifts, when a figure turns to face you, when a feeling suddenly has a shape, and that shape begins to do something, your one job is to stay present and engaged, to resist the pull toward observation and instead participate, to speak if speaking feels right, to ask if a question is rising, to listen, genuinely listen, to whatever comes back. Write it down. This part matters more than most people expect. The act of writing, of translating the interior experience into language, of giving it a form that exists outside your own head, does something. It anchors it. It makes it real in a different way. It also creates a record that you can return to, and returning to it weeks or months later, you will often find things you didn't notice the first time, layers that weren't visible when the experience was still fresh. But writing is also a form of respect. It says, what happened here was worth keeping. What was said deserved to be heard. There is one more thing, and it might be the most important. What you encounter in active imagination is not meant to stay in the session. The figures you meet, the things they say, the feelings that surface. They are pointing at something in your actual life. At a relationship that needs a different kind of honesty, at a choice that keeps getting postponed, at a part of yourself that wants expression and has been waiting for permission. The practice is not an escape from your life. It is a way of seeing your life more clearly than you can from the surface. Jung was insistent about this. He called it the ethical demand of the unconscious. What you discover below has to be brought back up, has to be lived somehow in the world. Otherwise, the practice becomes another form of avoidance, more sophisticated than most, but avoidance nonetheless. You go down to come back up differently. That is the whole movement, descent and return. And what you bring back with you, not as a concept, not as an insight you can summarize in a sentence, but as something that has genuinely shifted in how you carry yourself. That is the work. That is what this practice, when it's real, actually does. If you've made it this far with me, through everything we've sat with together in this video, I want to pause for just a moment before we move toward the end. This channel exists because there are people who are ready for a different kind of conversation. Not the kind that tells you what to think or hands you a system that promises to fix what feels broken, but the kind that goes beneath all of that. That takes the questions you carry seriously. That doesn't flinch from the harder territories of what it means to be awake and human and genuinely trying to understand yourself. If that's why you're here, if something in what we've explored today landed somewhere real, then subscribe to this channel. Turn on the notifications, because what we're building here, video by video, is a map, and every piece connects to the others in ways that will only become clearer as we go deeper together. Now, back to something that matters, because there is a question that tends to arrive after someone has their first real experience with active imagination. After the first genuine meeting with an interior figure, after the first conversation that surprised them, that moved something, that left them sitting quietly afterward with the particular feeling of having touched something true. The question is, now what? And it's the right question, because the meeting itself is not the destination. Something has shifted. That much is clear. The figure you encountered, whatever it said, whatever it showed you, it didn't leave you exactly where it found you. There is a subtle reorganization that happens in a person after genuine interior contact. Something that was previously pushing against you from below begins to feel more like something alongside you. The energy that was spent on suppression, on keeping that particular thing from surfacing, quietly becomes available for something else. You feel it before you can name it. A slight loosening, a quality of having more room inside than you had before. Not because anything has been resolved, necessarily, but because something has been acknowledged. And acknowledgement, it turns out, is what most of what lives below the surface was asking for all along. Not to be fixed, not to be transformed into something more acceptable. Simply to be seen, simply to have someone, you, your conscious self, turn toward it and say, I know you're there. I'm not pretending anymore that you're not. That moment of recognition changes the relationship between you and your own interior in a way that is difficult to reverse. Once you have genuinely met something that was previously unknown to you, you cannot unmeet it. It has a face now. It has a voice. It has a place in the conversation. And this is where something unexpected tends to happen in people who stay with the practice. The figures they feared most, the ones they circled around for months before finally sitting across from, turn out to carry some of the most important things. The rage that felt dangerous holds, underneath it, an enormous capacity for protection and boundaries. The grief that felt bottomless contains, at its floor, a depth of love that the person had never fully let themselves feel. The shadow figure, the one with the face they didn't want, arrives carrying qualities they had disowned so early in life that they had genuinely forgotten they ever had them. This is what alchemy was pointing at, not literally turning metal into gold, but this, the transformation of what was heavy, dark, and apparently worthless into something that turns out to be the most valuable thing you have. The lead was never the enemy. It was just waiting to be understood. There is a voice inside you that is not yours. Not exactly. But after everything we've explored today, after sitting with what active imagination actually is, what it asks of you, what it returns to you when you stay long enough, maybe that framing deserves a second look. Because what if the voice that doesn't feel like yours is actually the most authentic thing about you? What if everything you've been calling yourself, the personality you've constructed, the identity you maintain, the version of you that moves through the world and manages and filters and holds things together, is only the surface? And what's below isn't foreign at all, isn't other, is in fact the part of you that remembers everything you've forgotten, that held everything you couldn't carry consciously, that kept, with extraordinary care, the pieces of you that didn't fit the life you were handed. You didn't lose those pieces. They went somewhere, and they've been waiting. Not with impatience, not with anger, though anger is sometimes how they announce themselves, with the particular quality of something that knows it has time, that knows somehow that you will eventually stop running fast enough for the distance between you to close. That moment, when you finally stop, when you sit down, when you turn toward instead of away, that is not a defeat. That is not you finally breaking down. That is you finally being brave enough to begin the conversation that was always going to be the most important one of your life. The conversation with yourself, the real one, the one beneath all the others. Active imagination is not a cure. It is not a shortcut. It is not something you do once and then consider finished. It is a practice in the oldest sense of that word, something you return to again and again across the seasons of a life. And each time you return, you find something different waiting. Because you are different. Because the interior is not a fixed landscape. It moves with you. It grows with you. It responds to the choices you make above ground by rearranging itself below. What you bring back from those descents, the quiet shifts, the unexpected recognitions, the figures that become, over time, less like strangers and more like parts of yourself you are finally on speaking terms with. That is what individuation actually looks like from the inside. Not a dramatic transformation, not a moment of sudden enlightenment, a gradual, honest, sometimes uncomfortable process of becoming more fully what you already were, Jung lived with this practice until the end of his life. He never considered it finished. He never arrived at a point where he felt he had met everything that lived below. And there is something quietly reassuring in that, in the idea that the interior is not a problem to be solved, but a relationship to be sustained. That the work is not about reaching a destination, but about learning, slowly, to be at home in the full breadth of what you are. You are larger than you think you are. That is not inspiration. That is just true. And somewhere below the surface, in the place where the images live, and the figures wait, and the voice that is not quite yours keeps finding new ways to reach you. Something already knows it. The question that remains, the one I'll leave with you, not because I don't have thoughts about it, but because the answer belongs to you, is simply this. When will you sit down and listen? If this video moved something in you, if it named something you'd been carrying without quite having the words for, share it with 5 people who are ready for this kind of conversation. Not everyone is, but the ones who are will know the moment they hear it. Subscribe to Myth and Mirror. Leave a comment below. Not a reaction, but something real. Tell me what you encountered in yourself while watching this. Or tell me what you want to go deeper into next. The next video will be shaped in part by what you bring to that conversation. I'll see you there.